He was a minister in Birmingham, Alabama. He was courageous in a way that few people appreciate. Dr. King was actually very reluctant to come to Birmingham in 1963. Dr. King was very ambivalent about the ethics of using children as part of the Children's Crusade. And as you recall, the power of the Birmingham movement was that civil rights leaders said, we're going to get these young kids out of school and let them lead the march. And they couldn't tell their parents. They didn't tell the teachers. In contemporary context, you could see it as a pretty edgy way to make change. But Reverend Shuttlesworth was absolutely persuaded that this is what needed to happen. And he believed in the gospel, but he believed in the kind of gospel that required you to stand when other people are sitting and to speak when other people are quiet. And I really, really respect that. He's a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice. That's what we understand about him. But he was also a brilliant tactician, a brilliant strategist. He kept more cases from the U.S. Supreme Court than he took to the U.S. Supreme Court. And as a lawyer, you'll appreciate the significance of that. He always had a sense about when it was time to push the court to make a decision. And you have to be really careful about that, because if you push them before they're ready and they make the wrong decision, then you've created precedent that may block reform for a generation. And so I really respect how brilliant and strategic he was. We had many opportunities to take cases to the court. In the years leading up to that, we chose not to. We had basically a 5-year strategy to get young offenders who we thought would make compelling narratives around the set of issues that we thought were important. No, we were very determined to find a path to the court that maximized the chance of relief, because we knew that the odds were against us. And the same was true for Justice Marshall. You know, Brown and these cases had all kinds of precedent leading up to them that said you will not win. And so you have to maximize your chance of success. That was certainly what we were trying to do in Miller and Jackson and all the juvenile cases. Yeah. Now, this image of Dr. King leading a march is not an image that you see frequently. You see him at the March on Washington. You see him in different settings where he's giving speeches. We have a calendar, a civil rights, kind of a racial history calendar. And what we're trying to do with our calendar is actually give images that change this narrative, that get people to think not about the glory of the civil rights movement, not about the success, not about how transformational it is, but we want people to reflect on the pain, the anguish, the suffering, the humiliation about it. My favorite Ralph Abernathy story is that he was giving the warm-up speech for Dr. King in Mississippi at some place. He said, you know, when the civil rights movement prevails, we're going to have people calling us Mr. Jones and Ms. Smith and Miss Wilson and Ms. Clark and Mr. Clark, and they're going to call us Mr. and Ms. and Ms. and everything's going to change. And then he said, and maybe after we get freedom and after we get civil rights, we won't call them Mr. We'll call them by their first names. In fact, he said, when we get civil rights and we win this struggle, it's not even going to be Mississippi anymore, it's just going to be Sippy. And I love that story. She wanted to be a force. She wanted to attack segregation everywhere she saw it. And so it wasn't the first time she got arrested. She got arrested many more times after that. And I think she felt that that was her calling, you know, her challenge. And she thought it was important that people who weren't ministers, who didn't have doctorate degrees, be forceful leaders in the civil rights movement, because everybody said all the time, this is a movement for everybody, not just the preachers, not just the kind of the elites, if you will. And I think she very much recognized that. E.D. Nixon is from my town, Montgomery. Mr. Nixon, again, a fantastic organizer. The Montgomery bus boycott would not have succeeded without E.D. Nixon. He's the one who developed the resources necessary to organize transportation and get people from point A to point B. I love this story about how they were about to give up the boycott when this older woman stood up and said, "Don't y'all stop nothing for me." And she said, yes, I've got to get up and I've got to walk 3 miles in the morning, and yes, I work 10 and 12 hours, and yes, I've got to walk 3 miles back home at night. She said, but I'm not going to stop and you all can stop, and if you stop, I'll keep walking all by myself. And just when she thought the church was prepared to give up, she got up there and she said, you know, I've got to keep walking because I believe I'm going to sit in the front of a bus in Montgomery. And then she said, my feet are tired, but my soul is rested. And there is something about that spirit, which you see in the lives of people like E.D. Nixon and all of those great architects of the Montgomery bus boycott. It was the fearless, in many ways, he was the person that everybody talked about. He was doing the work in Mississippi, fearless, just would go to any place and be a witness. He said, basically, we have to show people that strength will prevail, that courage will prevail. And even when it doesn't in that moment, we have to keep making that witness. He embraced nonviolence with the kind of radicalism that even put many others in the civil rights movement to shame. Charles Hamilton Houston was in many ways the architect of the modern legal movement around civil rights. Houston was the dean of Howard Law School, which is where most people of color went to law school. And he would tell these black law graduates at Howard, when they graduated, he would get up and he would give a speech and he would say, because you are graduating from law school, you will be one of two things. He said, you'll either be a social engineer or you'll be a parasite. And you have to choose what you're going to be. He said, but because you have knowledge, because you have skills, because you can help people, you have to commit to engineering a society where we help more people. And if you don't do that, you're going to be drawing the blood from the community of people that gave you the space that you have in this law school. And I've always valued that orientation. I like Mr. Meredith because he's also dealing with what I'm dealing with, which is this sort of simplification of the civil rights movement. I'm very troubled by the way we are celebrating some of these 50th anniversary things. I don't like the way we've simplified it. We've made it sort of celebratory without talking about the challenges. You know, I get frustrated. You hear some people talk about the 50th anniversary, and it's almost as if, you know, the civil rights movement was this 3-day experience where first day Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat. And the next day, Dr. King led a march on Washington. And the third day, Congress signed all these laws. And isn't it wonderful that in 3 days, we created a different America? And if you think about it like that, you're going to get frustrated that people are still talking about race and bias and exclusion. I think for me, what I think about my work, when we started representing condemned people, you know, I think that if there have been 4 institutions that have shaped the lives of people of color in this country, I'd say it's slavery, terrorism between Reconstruction and World War II, apartheid in the civil rights era, and I think the 4th would be mass incarceration. The way in which we have used jails and prisons to stigmatize, to oppress, to create hopelessness in communities of color. And so for me, that's been the great institutional challenge that I've tried to take on. And so my work would be, my card would talk a lot about the work we're trying to do to reduce mass incarceration and to try to end the kind of race consciousness that has created so many unreliable outcomes. And there was an older man in the church. This older man was in a wheelchair, and he was staring at me pretty intensely all during my presentation. I mean, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I was taken aback, so I just looked at him, and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I really didn't know what to say. And then he smiled just a little bit, and he said, "I'll tell you what you're doing." And then he said, "You're beating the drum for justice." And I never will forget it. He says, "You're beating the drum for justice." And then he pulled me to him and he said, "Come here, come here, come here." He said, "You see this scar I have on my ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, in 1964, trying to register people to vote." He said, "You see this scar I have right here? I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi, trying to register people to vote in 1963. He said, "You see this spot over here? That's a bruise I got in Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963. And then he said, "People think that these are my cuts and my bruises and my scars." And he put his hands on his head. He says, "These aren't cuts, bruises, and scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And if I ever get a card, I'd be honored if just somebody said he tried to beat the drum for justice. That's all I'm looking for. And that's all we can do. But I'm really, really privileged to be doing the work that I'm doing in the place that I do it.